So I just want to welcome everyone. This is the inaugural event for the new Center for Labor and Community. And so we're really excited to be here. So my name is Steve McKay. I'm an associate professor of sociology. I'm also co-chair of the Santa Cruz Faculty Association. And as a graduate student, I was a member of the TAA, Local 3220, in Madison, Wisconsin, so you can see that. And so we're just really happy to have, we met a lot of people last night, and people already, just the organic kind of solidarity that we're seeing among the graduate students. So just a special shout out for all those graduate students that came from different places. I know we have Dartmouth in the house. We have Temple. And we have Michigan in the house. And I know there's a lot of other ones, but I just want to shout because those folks I got to talk to last night. So a couple things, again, just some housekeeping things before we get started. We're excited to have a full day. Again, you all found the food on the second floor. There's bathrooms down there, and there's also a bathroom up here. The gallery, which is really great, this new space and gallery, is closed now, but tomorrow they'll have a tour, so we'll be able to visit the gallery that's downstairs. We'll have lunch, again, where we had it, where breakfast was, but you can always bring up food, and there's these two nice, as things warm up, hopefully, outdoor spaces that you can be in. And the idea behind the whole conference is just to gather people who are together in struggle and to learn from others who are also in struggle. So we really want to keep it today as a way to present some of the issues, debate things, and then tomorrow is really a working session. The mics will be off, the recording devices will be off, and you get to roll up your sleeves and really talk to each other about what's important to you and what you can share in your experience, and then what you can learn. Just a couple quick thank yous before we get going. First, Sarah Mason, who's been helping organize this. And the whole conference organizing committee. So Jack Davies, who's Jack? Alex, Jess, who's downstairs watching, Rebecca Gross, Catherine Rogers, Debbie Gould, Miriam Greenberg, and Jessica Taft. I want to thank the Santa Cruz Faculty Association who co-sponsored today's event, especially the reception. So that was really important. So thanks for the second. And then we're the new center is part of the Institute for Social Transformation on campus. So Chris Benner and then the staff of the Institute for Social Transformation did a lot of the logistics and things to get this going. So I want to thank Evan and Sue, who are right here. Thank you. And Dario, who's not here, but also helped a lot. And I just want to start first, again, with a land acknowledgement that's very important. The land on which we gather is the unceded territory of the Waswas-speaking Yupi tribe. The Amamutsan tribal band, comprised of the descendants of indigenous people taken to missions Santa Cruz and San Juan Bautista during Spanish colonization of the Central Coast, is today working to restore traditional stewardship practices on these lands and heal from historic trauma. So I just want to just a brief word about the center. So the Center for Labor and Community came out with funding, partly from the support from the California Federation of Labor and labor allies in the California legislature. And there was a historic allocation last year of $13 million in the state budget for research and support for labor studies in the University of California. It was the single largest budget increase in the UC Labor Center since 1964. And so in addition to the labor centers at UCLA and UC Berkeley and UC Merced, there are now 6 new labor centers. So the total of 9 new labor centers across the UC campuses. And for Santa Cruz, that has a very active, staff unions are very active, the lecturers unions, faculty unions, and particularly the graduate students. We were thinking what better way to start and think about what could Santa Cruz as a new labor center do that some of the other labor centers either don't do, or that we could kind of find some way that sort of what our niche was going to be. And in talking with Sarah and a bunch of other folks who have been involved in a lot of the struggles locally, we thought one of the most important things we can we're involved in and can learn from is to think about the labor upsurge across the higher education. And not just in so many places with here we had the Wildcat strike and then the UAW strike, but also, in solidarity with the other unions on campus and thinking about wall to wall, but also this kind of region. And so really it was an idea to bring together not just the thinkers, but the doers, right, who are in struggle and learn from each other. And so that was the impetus of this whole thing. And so we just hope in this next day and a half that you have a chance to just really dig in, right, with your fellow workers here and think about, how do we struggle together collaboratively? How do we learn from each other? And how do we build power together? And with that, I want to invite Jeb Perucker from the AFT. He's going to be the moderator of the opening session, which we're very excited about. The panel, first panel, Striking to Win, Where Does Power Come From, and How Do We Wield It? Jeb.
Yeah, I think now would be appropriate for the panelists. Okay, let's get started. Thanks for coming, everyone. So I'm Jeb. I'm an organizer with UC-AFT here in Santa Cruz, and I'm just going to kick this off. I'm going to introduce our panelists, and then we'll have time for questions and answers at the end. As Steve mentioned, this panel is really going to be where we kind of drill down on strike strategy questions. We're going to be hearing a lot about the long haul strategy, and we're going to be hearing from panelists who are all themselves engaged in various ways in these struggles. So without further ado, I'll just introduce people. Okay, cool. Right. Okay, so in reverse order of how the presentations are going to be going, we've got Sarah Mason and Jack Davies. Sarah is a PhD candidate in sociology at UC Santa Cruz and head steward with UAW 2865. Jack is a PhD candidate in the history of consciousness department at UC Santa Cruz, and he's the unit chair of UAW 2865, my first union. And Sarah and Jack are also probably two of the biggest pains in the ass for UCSC's administration, and so that's like no small praise there. So we also have James Eastwood, who's a senior lecturer in politics and international relations at Queen Mary University in London. He's the co-chair of the Queen Mary branch of the University and College Union. He's also the co-author with Zara Dinan of the article How to Stop the University, which was one that was very widely circulating here a while back, which was published by Notes from Below in December of 2022. And then finally, and I want to pause here, we've got Lucy Peterson, who's a graduate student worker and PhD candidate in political theory at the University of Michigan. She's co-chair of the organizing committee there in the Graduate Employee Organization. And hopefully everyone already knows this, but the University of Michigan has been on strike since the end of March. And this is huge. They withheld grades. They're at I think a crucial moment in their strike right now. And I want to start this off. I know we've already done some applause and thank you for everyone that has made this conference happen. But I think all of us are deeply, deeply, deeply indebted to what the comrades in Michigan are doing right now. The strategies and tactics that are being developed and tested in Ann Arbor right now are the ones that we're all going to be using for years and years to come. And so we just clapped. Let's do it. Let's do it more. Let's do it louder. Let's do it so the comrades back in Michigan can hear us and go into the summer strong and come back on strike in the fall. So thank you, Lucy. And with that, let's hear from you, Lucy. How goes the struggle back east?
Yeah, thanks for that. On the ground, it doesn't feel that good, so the clapping helps a lot. and maybe some of our people are watching, so that's meaningful. I want to start just giving a little bit of overview about the campaign so that the strategy stuff makes sense. So in terms of the issues that we're bargaining over, the main thing has been a living wage, and that has opened up into a series of issues about equity as well. So we've talked about childcare as one of the key things. So a living wage doesn't mean the same thing for everyone. So that's one of the big ways that we've motivated the campaign. Other things that we're fighting for include a non-police, unarmed emergency response. So we've talked a lot at the University of Michigan campus about armed police. They were armed in the late 90s, and we've done some work to dig up that history, and our union has done a lot of work to change policing on campus. And then the other big issue that we're fighting over is harassment on campus and having ways to get graduate students out of unhealthy, unsafe advising relationships. So those are some of the bigger issues, and primarily the wage. That's the main thing that's driving us through. In terms of the campaign timeline itself, we have been bargaining since November, and the campaign started with a kind of protracted and frustrating argument with management about having negotiations open. So we wanted members to be able to go in there. They were really intransigent about that. So we fought with them about that for months, and that kind of kicked off the frustration of the campaign. Like, a lot of people were feeling disrespected about not being able to be there. And so we bargained for a while. There was essentially no movement on anything. We moved to a strike authorization. And the day before we struck, the university offered us a living wage outside of negotiations. They said, we're changing the funding model for PhD students, going to be funded 12 months. And it essentially matched our compensation offer. We still went on, we kind of freaked out for a second. We were like, oh no, this is going to ruin everything. We still went on strike. And that has really helped us frame things in terms of shifting the balance of power. We want them to talk to us on our terms. We don't want them going around our union. So the issues of respect, equality, and dignity have become really central to things. And so we struck at the end of March. That went on for a few weeks before finals. We made it to finals. Still no movement at the table. Things were getting more and more intense. And then we finally got to the grading deadlines. During the instructional strike, we had the other faculty who could scab our labor sign a pledge saying, hold the line, don't scab our labor, and that went pretty well. By the time we got to grades, the pressure on faculty was much more intense. So we had them sign another pledge saying that we're not going to submit grades for you. That did work for a little while, but as the pressure intensified, many of them did submit grades for GSIs. And there's one important exception to that, which there's a section of instructors that teach their own classes. And it's not easy to scab that labor because the course is a self-contained thing, unlike many of the other instructional structures. So there were all of these department chairs who were being instructed to put in grades for these students, for these teachers. And they said no for a while, and pressure intensified, and eventually what happened with these last holdout classes, the instructors of record, most of the chairs submitted all A's for those students. So that's kind of the timeline of the campaign, just to give some context. So for the talk itself, I want to talk about the developments in our strategic thinking, and then some of the challenges we faced and lessons that we're still learning, and would be interested to hear what you all think about those things too. So early on in our strike planning, there were a couple of different ways of thinking about strike power within the union itself. For a long time in the union, probably also in your unions, there's this idea, it's hegemonic, that you're most powerful the day before you strike. So that's kind of what we were up against. That line has really demotivated a serious consideration of how to build leverage through a strike. So considerations of striking that went beyond that, there were some, tended to focus on the number of days. Should we strike 1 day? Should we strike 2 days? Should we strike on a day, off a day? That kind of thing. And behind those ideas of a time-limited strike, at least in our context, I'm not sure if this is generalizable, but it was thinking about the strike as a performance, not as something that you're leveraging, more of a demonstration. And so again, there wasn't really a serious consideration of how you can build leverage by way of a strike. So alternatively, there were some of us in the union that were advocating for an open-ended strike strategy. And our hypothesis there was that we would be able to build power by causing a protracted disruption of university operations. So that's how we could build power through a strike. And in pursuing an open-ended strike strategy, our primary consideration, at least early on, was how to sustain a strike in a hostile legal climate, which is Michigan. To put that in different terms, our strategy was primarily defensive, not offensive. And that was most of our thinking. And I think it's worth reflecting on why we were in the defensive position and then how we eventually got out of it. In Michigan, we were particularly sensitive to the challenge of striking under the threat of a court order to return to work. That's because we went on strike in 2020 and our strike got broken in exactly that manner. So in fall 2020, we went on an emergency strike against the university's attempts to continue business as usual during the pandemic. Teaching classes, all of that they wanted to go on. And after 5 days of us being on strike, they filed an injunction against us. And essentially what happened is we were completely unprepared for that threat, and there was mass panic in the union. And the leaders at the time didn't really know what an injunction was, and so they couldn't communicate about it to members, and it contributed to spreading misinformation about the risks of injunctions to the union and to international students. So there was a line like, the union's gonna be bankrupt, and that international students are gonna be prosecuted. So collectively, we decided to retreat from the strike, and union members voted to accept an offer which wasn't very good and end the strike in exchange for pulling the injunction filing. So 3 years later, that was very much on our minds. We were really worried that an injunction could stop our strike, even if we want it to be open-ended. So we have the first challenge of how do you get everybody to agree to an open-ended strike? Then how do you keep it going? That was the big question for us. And there was kind of a widespread fatalistic attitude that even if we did strike, the university would be able to break it in a matter of days by going to the courts. So given that context, our focus was on inoculating members to strike even under a court order to return to work. That was our goal. And that organizing was pretty successful. We built unanimous consensus, at least among the department organizers. There's about 60 of them, and they all voted unanimously that that's what they were going to organize towards. And so they did file the injunction, we went to court, and we were all really surprised when the injunction was denied. So we were not facing the situation that we expected. And so the vote of department organizers to defy the injunction revealed to me the extent to which defeatist attitudes about fighting anti-union labor law is to some extent a function of our unions themselves and not an inevitable force of the law. Moreover, we needed to be a lot more concerned with our offensive strategy, and that's what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the time. And we had to figure it out as we went along because we weren't really prepared. So there are two challenges that were especially important as the strike went on. First, there was the issue of our collective strength and our ability to stay together under increasingly intense pressure and fatigue. So how do you have a collective understanding of your power? And secondly, there was a question of where our labor was most valuable and how could we wield the withdrawing of it to the greatest effect. So to the first one, understanding our collective power. So as bargaining went by, we weren't seeing any movement. So it wasn't an effective strategy to say when we get movement, well, we're measuring our power by the movement at the bargaining table. There was no movement at the bargaining table. So there was a pressing need to understand whether and to what extent we were building power and a need to attest collectively to our commitment to keep going. So it was important to provide a framework for analyzing our power such that workers could assess the collective strength of the union and make decisions about whether we had the capacity to keep going so that we didn't retreat prematurely. Going into the strike, we wanted to guide members to vote to continue based on concrete assessments of our strike power rather than movement at the bargaining table or their feelings, which are frankly negative at any given turn. So at membership meetings, we would present raw numbers of strikers, and then we would put those in terms of percentages of the unit, of the department, emphasizing where we had majorities, supermajorities, and where we didn't. In addition to that, we emphasize that not all graduate workers are the same. So most teaching assistants are concentrated in our College of Literature, Science, and the Arts. So having a lot of strikers there was really important to us. By contrast, there was very few instructors in the College of Engineering. So even if strike numbers went down there as things went on, that wasn't especially meaning to us because we weren't powerful there anyways. Moreover, strikers in departments where graduate students are instructors of record was another especially significant metric for us. And finally, we would assess how successfully we were resisting attempts by management to undermine the impact of the strike. Scabbing, how effective was that? It turned out that understanding things in terms of percent of workers participating came off as somewhat abstract in our membership meetings. And it made us question why we were trying to communicate by presenting our support as majoritarian or supermajoritarian percentages. And a couple of weeks into the strike, we changed course on that and started gathering strike department reports, thank you, from the department organizers. And they would develop qualitative assessments at the department level. And that was through department level discussions. And then every department organizer would essentially fill in a weekly report, and then we would share them at membership meetings. And that's how we generated a sense of confidence in the bonds we had with each other and had a pretty concrete understanding that we were generating some kind of disruption. Couldn't quantify it, but the people in those departments knew that they were doing that and they were able to share that. There wasn't a magic number where we could say, this is the number of strike power we need to go on for another week because we have X amount of strikers. But the qualitative assessments did put a lot of meaning behind our togetherness in addition to our power. And the reports created a way for us to have a concrete sense that we could, in fact, keep going, that we weren't losing power. And so week after week, we had a weekly membership meeting. We would vote about whether to keep going, and those votes were essentially unanimous every single time. So the message was getting across. We were on the same page. So the second issue is how we could wield that power to greatest effect. And we got to experiment with a couple of things. So we started with an instructional strike that moved on to grading organically. And I could say a bit about both of those. So with respect to instruction, our thought was that the impact of lost instruction was cumulative and that our power correlated with the number of lost instructional hours. And to flesh that out a little bit, we were thinking that instructional hours are most painfully felt if they pile up, especially for courses that have like a strict sequence, like language classes or calculus, things like that. And relatedly, we wanted to disrupt the instruction for as many students as possible. So the computer science department has one class that has 1,000 people. And the class is so large that the students get into office hours on a lottery system. You might get 5 minutes with your instructor if you win the lottery. So given that a class like that is already on the brink of dysfunction, we're like, we gotta get that class because it's already ridiculous. So that was one thing. And then final exams, we wanted to disrupt those as we could. And then eventually we got to the grading of it all. So one thing with the instruction that became clear was that the university was able to withstand a lot of missed instructional hours. And that was a choice they made. So faced with the choice of either settling or withstanding, week after week, they chose to withstand. And we had to adapt to that. And administrators provided a lot of mechanisms for doing this, encouraging self-study, combining sections, pushing instructors to adapt the syllabus. And the apparent ease with which management moved through lost instruction suggests that instruction itself might not put enough strain on the university. Alternatively, the effect of lost instruction on degree production is very delayed. So, and now we know that management has ways to accommodate that. That's also something that we can adapt to. Another big thing is that the other instructional staff, the lecturers and the faculty, significantly indemnified the university almost thoughtlessly by compensating for the instructional losses through course adaptation. They're the ones in front of the students. They're kind of making up the fact that the GSIs aren't there, the graduate student instructors. The other thing is that in the face of the instructional strike, the administration maintained a pretty cool head. So there wasn't really a lot of drama around it. I mean, we were picketing and there were things going on, but in contrast with the grading strike, which is what I'll move to now because I only have 2 minutes, there was a lot of frenzy around the withholding of grades. So that signaled to us that maybe that was more powerful. So when it came to withholding grades, we got a really different response, both from administration and from the community. At the point of the grading deadlines, a lot more people became implicated in the strike than before. All of a sudden, provosts, deans, department chairs, tenured faculty who weren't overseeing graduate students all started contacting us and getting involved in various ways. And with the faculty that did oversee GSIs, up until that point, I don't think they fully understood. There was kind of a collective denial that graduate students actually did work. So we're like, yeah, the grades are going to get put in when this happens. And at the point when the grades were actually missing, I think that's the first time that people really realized it en masse. So there was kind of a collective reckoning about the value of graduate student labor, and that it would actually involve agency on their part to break the strike or hold the strike, one way or the other. And that kind of manifested in anger at graduate students, at administration. So I think our most significant misunderstanding with respect to our analysis of power was the extent to which graduate students control our own labor. Since we most often work with supervising faculty, our strike power was constantly mediated by people who had not been organized into our collective militancy, which is what our focus was on. We thought that the best chance we had of fighting the boss and winning was being organizationally unified and enough to carry a strike through as much time as possible. In other words, by withdrawing the labor that we had the most control over. And we did do that. We were successful at doing that, but the faculty scabbed significantly. And while we did disrupt pedagogical outcomes, a variety of courses, we were less successful at interrupting the production of complete transcripts on the scale that we thought we were going to be able to do. An exception to this is the instructors of record. The withheld grades of these instructors proved to be a significant source of leverage. The university's reaction to these grades revealed the extent to which the production of transcripts really is something that they can't function without, which is why they chose to give all A's to students in classes where they couldn't find scabs, or to break the strike. Whether or not grade falsification can truly indemnify the university remains to be seen. That's playing out right now. But it's doubtful that this approach could work across multiple final grading periods, is what we're thinking. So to conclude, I think striking for the long haul is especially important in the higher education context, and maybe especially for teaching assistants. First, regarding the degree production process, the time of the production of this weird product is drawn out across semesters, across academic years. So it follows that if you want to disrupt that, you have to mirror how that works. So building power here isn't just a matter of being on strike for X number of days, like we thought early on, but rather we can accumulate power by disrupting the degree production process across multiple points, or inflection points. However, the effects of that accumulation do not seem to be immediate or automatic, which is important to keep in mind. The administration does have various tactics to defer the effects of our lost labor, such as faculty scabbing, falsifying grades. There's probably many more. Importantly, however, these tactics are not sustainable for the long haul. You can't keep doing them. So it's not the case that the administration figures out a way to withstand a strike that we've lost, or even that we've lost power. But I think a better way to think about it is that they can delay and defer dealing with disruption. It's much less clear that they can rely on those delaying tactics for the long haul, either by getting instructional staff to scab indefinitely or by falsifying grades over and over again. So that's all I have.
Thanks, Lucy. That was great. And I'm sure there is going to be lots to get into in discussion. Okay, so next up we've got James Eastwood. So tell us what's going on the other side of the world.
Great. Is this on? Can people hear me from that? Yeah, it sounds like it is. Hi everyone. So this is a presentation based on an article which some of you may know about called How to Stop a University that I co-authored with Zara Dinnan, who's co-chair with me of the Queen Mary branch of the UCU, University and College Union in the UK. Okay. Great. Thanks. And it reflects, obviously, it's a shared piece of work between her and myself, but also it reflects a sort of a process of collective learning and struggle over many, many years, both at the Queen Mary branch and also in the wider higher education sector in the UCU in the UK. And since I understand, and it's still kind of a slightly astonishing fact to me that this has been read by quite a few people beyond the UK context, I'm not going to just repeat that article. You can find it online and read it. I wanted to use the time today to say a bit about the experiences that shaped that article, where it came from, and then to try and draw out what I think are some of the broader lessons that will be relevant for not just the UK context, and what it says about higher education labour struggles in general. So in terms of the context, there are two really important immediate contexts for understanding where this article arguing for the indefinite strike came from. The first is the 5-year-long disputes in UK higher education that have been going on between the UCU and increasingly intransigent employers over a wide range of issues. And the second is the incredibly hostile union-busting attempt that took place at our specific branch at Queen Mary, and how we had to learn to respond and adapt to that. So in terms of the higher education context in the UK, we're in this cycle of struggle that really kicked off properly in 2018 with the dispute to save the pension scheme of a large number of British universities. And that's now broadened out to a wider struggle over paying conditions, especially over casualisation and insecure employment, which has resulted in more or less annual bouts of strike action pretty much every year since 2018, save for the pandemic year. And while it looks like these strikes have been effective at defending members from the worst of the pension cuts, although that's still to be exactly determined, there's currently a nationwide marking and assessment boycott or grade strike in the UK to try and defeat the attempt to impose another drastically below inflation pay offer and to get better terms and conditions and pay equality and better workload. So that's a grading strike at over 145 British universities happening right now, which is highly significant. But it should be said that part of the reason why the dispute is still ongoing is that despite the wide readership we got for our article and the positive reception we had for it, we were not successful in persuading people to do this. This is a path not taken. And part of the reason we're in the situation we're in now is because we decided to take a strategy which was a bit more piecemeal. And whether or not that was a good idea, it's still going to be playing out. One of the notable trends in recent years in the struggle in the UK has been the growing resilience, and stop me if this sounds familiar, of employers in the face of time and limited strikes. Even when faced with multiple weeks of missed teaching, employers have not felt pressured enough to settle with us. It's partly a density issue. UCU's density in the higher education sector among academics is like a third. But it's also to do with the structure of the way that universities get fees from students. Students pay their fees annually, and universities still receive these fees even when strikes take place. Students have shown more willingness recently to try and challenge this, to try and take legal action to get their money back, but that's a very difficult process for them. And it's quite easy for universities to say that even if they missed a week here or a week there, eventually that class was made up and they received the education they were originally promised. And this protects them against demands for mass fee refunds. It's only if strikes last a very long time or actually prevent students from progressing or graduating that we have significant leverage against that potential financial interest they have. But that's hard and costly to achieve. And it requires planning and careful concentration of the action. So that's some of the lessons and learning we've been doing, like seeing how employers have adapted to this thing, which was initially quite shocking, but now they're quite used to and inured to the idea of time-limited strikes. The Queen Mary context, and my university in particular, during the round of strike action initiated in 2021-22, and then again in this academic year, our employer at Queen Mary decided to pursue an extremely aggressive stance towards the union in order to attempt to break our action. They were exploiting grey areas in a legal terrain in the UK, which is already incredibly anti-worker. And they announced, and there is legal precedent for this, they announced that unless staff, let's say you miss one day of class because of strike action, they say that unless when you come back to work, you reschedule that class and deliver the stuff that you withheld your labour and weren't paid for not delivering, unless you reschedule that class, they will take 100% of your pay every day until you do. So people were being threatened with 39 days of pay deductions in some cases for cancelling one class. It's extreme level of employer bullying and intimidation. And it's obviously designed to intimidate workers and make them capitulate and not take strike action in the first place. If you want the full story of what happened next and why that didn't work and how we defeated it and how we're actually in a much better place now, buy me a beer later. It's not the topic for this presentation. But the significant thing is, I suppose, firstly to say that when you're faced with that kind of employer tactic, the indefinite strike starts to sound a lot more attractive. And our branch, in contrast to the wider membership, has been much more willing to vote for it at a local level. But what's important I want to pick out particularly is the echo of what I was saying before about lost education and fee refunds. Because you can see in this employer demand, make up the teaching, the same anxiety that I expressed before about if we can't prove they eventually got the outcomes some way over the course of their degree, we're under pressure from regulators and particularly from legal action from students. So in making this threat, the employers actually revealed to us a really important pressure point for them, which is that they need to be able to prove that the students will get the outcomes they need in order to be able to progress and graduate through their studies. And so the indefinite strike is designed to press down really hard on that pressure point on our employer. Obviously, what makes an indefinite strike particularly effective for that purpose is the same thing that makes it effective in any sector. So you have a lot of control over the dispute when you're doing an indefinite strike. You take the control away from the employer. They can't plan exactly around when the strikes are going to be. They don't necessarily know how long it's going to go on. You say you're not going to come back until you get the demands that you want. And the fear that the action could go on for a longer, uncertain period of time forces the employer to kind of think about offering more to stave off not only what the action they know is going to have happened, but also the potential action that they might be facing in the future, that they have to kind of hedge against that risk that it could escalate and go on for a very long time unknown to them. And so this forces them to offer more than they would in a situation of time-limited strikes, even if you end up taking the same number of days, potentially. This point is important, but I think it's probably not the most important observation we make when thinking about the specificity of higher education struggles. But one thing, some of what makes time-limited strikes so easy to counter is that in the UK context, at least, we have to announce our strike days by law 2 weeks in advance. So there's a lot of planning employers can do around them. And that observation doesn't necessarily carry beyond the UK context. There's also not too much specific about higher education in the sort of point about the uncertainty thing that I'm saying here. It misses a lot about the context of higher education and the nature of university work. And it sort of actually risks slightly misunderstanding and misperceiving what's distinctive about a university, because we know that a university is not a traditional factory-like workplace. It can't be shut down simply through the erection of a picket line. University is a place where staff, where students live, and also where other kinds of staff, other groups of staff continue to work during our strikes. And the work that we do is not generally a product that's produced to a very tight schedule. And when we come back to work, we end up picking up the work around it. The broader set of work we do as academics flows around the blockages you erect during a time-limited strike. Mm-hmm. Pickets alone can't stop a university. So building on this problem, I think a more important point I want to emphasize in the article is the way that the nature of university work, of academic labor, has constituted us as workers in a way which makes time-limited strike action particularly ineffective, before you even started it. Academic work relies on a highly distributed model of individual self-management. Universities' managers usually do not know and don't care how we teach, how we organize teaching, how we deliver it. All they care about is that whether or not the student receives the stuff that was advertised to them, in order that they can then go on to receive a grade and graduate in exchange for a fee. And they expect us as staff to find our own way to deliver this. It's instead us as workers who are much more likely to care about how we deliver that teaching and about the experience of our students. A huge part of our professional identity, the ideology of academic labor, is about this. We give ourselves to our work, and we have an expectation that giving ourselves to our work will then reward us. But this is not true. I'm thinking here of Sarah Jaff's adage that work won't love you back. And it's this love of our work, this giving of ourselves, this cannibalization of our own goodwill, upon which the modern neoliberal university relies. And it's precisely that tendency that the management will exploit in a time-limited strike. Once you come back to work, you immediately begin to undo the effect of the strike action you've just taken. The content of the class, which was just cancelled, will likely get shuffled around to ensure the most essential material still gets delivered. Mm-hmm. You deliberately skip only the least important content to minimize the impact on your students. Even if you don't want to do this, you kind of can't avoid it. You can't teach more advanced topics without going back and teaching the basic topic first. So, and a further problem is that aside from the scheduled teaching that happened on that particular day, the administration, the grading, the research you didn't do while on strike will still be there when you get back. You still have to do it at some point, and you may end up doing it at the weekend to kind of catch up on the stuff that you missed during the strike. So these problems are a common reason why many higher education workers in the UK doubt the effectiveness of strike action in many cases. And it's excuses they commonly give for not participating. Even some higher education workers in the UK who do strike cancel the teaching on that day, but then go home and do research and admin and marking to catch up on their overwork. And they do that because they recognize that to the employer, it literally does not matter at all when you do that work. They do not care. And even for those of us who are striking and turning out to picket lines, it's still a source of professional embarrassment to go into a classroom and say, sorry, this class is going to be really shit because I haven't prepared because I was on strike yesterday. And the ideology of academic labour and our sort of investment in what we do makes it really, really hard. And it's always working against us, no matter how hard we try. And the problem of time-limited strike is also it creates hierarchies between different kinds of work. So scheduled teaching gets often prioritized or fetishized because it's scheduled. It's the only thing that has to happen at a particular time. And so we think that in a time-limited strike, you have to target that. That leaves untouched a whole range of other academic work, administration, marking, teaching, administration, marking, and research that happens in a much more flexible way around that. And the problem is that you're then only withdrawing the one thing that it's easy for the management to replace afterwards by the reshuffling of work that happens, the reorganization of content and delivery that happens afterwards. And it leads us to ignore the fact that if you did cease all that other work that's going on at the same time, that cessation will gradually accumulate and cause significant disruption to the university. And this is what led us to identify the indefinite strike as the form of action that we wanted to advocate. Because when you take indefinite action, all that mitigation that we normally start to do as soon as a time-limited strike ends is suddenly off the table. We can't be relied to pick up that crucial topic again in next week's class because we have no idea if next week's class is going to happen. And all that other labour we aren't used to withholding is suddenly added to our leverage. You can't reschedule the committee meeting to next week because everyone's diary is still blocked out. You can't reassure students when they're going to get their grades because no idea when everyone's going to come back. You can't get the research bid submitted because the office isn't open. And this, in addition, creates much more space for all the organising work that you want to do instead of academic labour that people often skip during the strike. We repeatedly see a pattern during time-limited strikes in the UK. Wherever people return to the workplace in the breaks between strike action, they get dragged back into the world of work and they get taken away from an organising space and the collective mentality of that. Moving in and out of strike action is very, very demobilising, demotivating. It's hard to stop a university when you're repeatedly called back to keep it going. But in the indefinite strike, our work stops, but the organising continues. My co-author Zara also reminded me in a message this morning that another advantage of this approach is the way that it not only refuses hierarchies between different kinds of work, but also it starts to refuse hierarchies between different kinds of academic worker. In our union in UCU, there's been a real difficulty in terms of the internal hierarchies between these different kinds of workers. Academics and non-academics, students and faculty, those with marking and those without, casualized staff and non-casualized staff, migrant workers and those with citizenship. Actions which target a particular kind of work or a particular time in the calendar tend to leave workers who are in the crunch points, in the choke points, very vulnerable and exposed. And we're seeing this right now in the middle of our marking boycott, that people feel under an awful lot of pressure when they're in one of those zones. Holding that on your own, or what feels like on your own, can be very, very hard and isolating. But it's those people we really rely on to actually block the choke point of the academic grade production. So the logic of the indefinite strike, starting much earlier than just at the end of the production process, is to challenge these hierarchies and to break that isolation. There's no privileged kind of worker who's identified as being the most important kind of worker. There's no differentiation between the work which we identify being as the most important and those which isn't. Instead, all work stops. And once it stops, we continue to block it by allowing the unfinished work to gradually accumulate around us. In the indefinite strike, every single day that passes, the pile of unfinished work, the mountain of indefinitely postponed administration, preparation, teaching, marking just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And rather than diminishing as a time-limited strike approaches its end, your leverage continues to grow the more action you take. So it's not the case that you're most powerful the day before the strike. You're most powerful the longer and longer your strike goes on. Nothing gets done. No one goes back. Everyone stays out until our demands are met to our satisfaction. That's the power of the indefinite strike, and that's how you should stop a university.
Okay, next up we've got Jack and Sarah.
Okay, is this in a good spot? Cool. Okay, so firstly, it's really great to be here. The amount of you I've been on Zoom with or read your writing about strike strategy, it's yeah. So thank you very much to the organizers and for everyone for coming out. So Sarah and I and a series of comrades in here actually have been part of 2 strikes at the University of California, Santa Cruz. The first was a wildcat strike in the middle of a contract. The second one was in the context of a contract campaign, a strike to win a contract. So we want to present some perspectives that we've developed on strike and organizing strategy through these 2 sequences. I'm going to talk about the wildcat and then Sarah about the more recent contract one. So I'm just going to give a very clipped account of the wildcat just so everyone's minimally familiar with what I'm talking about. So our wildcat strike began as a grade withholding action. In fact, in December 2019, we were demanding that the local admin here annually adjust our salary such that we would no longer be rent burdened. This meant we would not spend more than 30% of our income on rent, in a place where it's typical for grad workers to spend 50 or 60% of their income on rent and sometimes more. We called this adjustment COLA, and the struggle then, after the grade strike, unfolded into a full work stoppage the following February, and then lasted all the way into the COVID lockdowns. The picket line saw some very heavy police interactions. About 100 of us were fired in February, and then we won our jobs back in a couple of waves. So I have 2 major points to hit upon about this experience. The first is about pre-strike organizing and militancy, and the second one about striking to win in the university. So what became the Wildcat Strike began as a campaign calling for the end of rent burden. This campaign was conceived and set in motion by a small group, and this is what I want to highlight. There were 10 or so people who set about building up a campaign around this issue that we knew was the single most dismal and humiliating condition in the work and home lives of members. And the campaign electrified an organizing milieu that was previously muted. It was characterized by scattered and short-lived campaigns, by low turnout to meetings of self-styled organizers and activists, often with axes to grind internally. The union as such, and despite the perpetual email pleading of its leadership, was frankly irrelevant to workers' lives. In short, there were various small groups and then a mass of workers who always succeeded in failing to notice them. In our experience, this is the baseline in higher ed organizing, and neither the official leadership or the staff, and nor the dissidents and troublemakers, can honestly claim to be more than a small group. So the COLA campaign fundamentally differed from the other strategies that were being tried at the time. It addressed a wide mass of workers. It articulated the single biggest problem, being the rent burden, with its solution, the COLA adjustment, and then it synchronized everyone's attention and action on those terms. And in the end, it was dozens of workers who were calling for strike action, not our small group. And then hundreds more voted, in fact, to strike. What we, I think, can be said to have achieved in hindsight, as one small group among several, was to foster the possibility of collective struggle, which was long prepared by material circumstances, and then to recognize and respond openly to a moment in which genuine worker militancy expressed itself, rather than attempt to redirect, delay, or otherwise manage it. So our small group here at UCSC has grown larger and more experienced between the tides, but a broad-based rank-and-file leadership resistant to the compromised positions of labor law, of contracts, union staffers, capable of asserting its power whenever necessary. This remains an aspiration for us, and I assume for many of you as well. So in our context, and maybe in yours as well, intervening as organizers requires the initiative of principled smaller groups who have coherent political analyses, strategies, and demands. But these initiatives cannot attribute automatic significance to the small group. In fact, that's the worst mistake. Mm-hmm. They must take as their basis the real demands and grievances expressed by wider layers of workers, and not abstract or generic appeals to things like anti-austerity or for the public good, and these kinds of familiar appeals. And then the other thing we've learned is that they must have a strategy adequate to the demands. You can demand anything you want. If you don't have a credible way of winning it, why would anyone take you seriously? So in the Wildcat, this began with a grade strike, and this brings us to the second point for my portion here on strike strategy. So through the duration of this Wildcat strike, our administration showed that they were far more concerned about the missing grades from fall than they were about the empty classrooms in the winter. This was something of a revelation for us as strikers at the time, as though we had tripped upon something like a choke point, even as we are experiencing certain limitations to the tactic. Since the Wildcat, the grade withholding tactic has received a lot of attention, and in no small part thanks to comrades in the UK. But in our context, there's this kind of two approaches that we would disagree with. One is to fetishize the grades somewhat, to imagine them as like a silver bullet. We think this is a bit wishful and ungrounded, that the missing grades are a genuine problem for the boss, but they take time to take effect. And sometimes, and as we heard in Michigan, they require a certain minimum solidarity from other instructors at the university. The other approach we encounter with this is just to dismiss the grades altogether as meaningless because of the availability of admin workarounds. We think this is especially dismal for its reflexive assumption of worker powerlessness and for failing to see the admin workarounds as themselves a terrain of struggle. They're an opportunity to build solidarity with other workers and students and to politicize the erosion of academic freedom and worker control. So both attitudes, we think, fail to see the grades for what they really are, which is not more or less than a very significant point of leverage in the context of a longer struggle. So the Wildcat picket line closed with the California lockdown orders for COVID, and we finally submitted grades in that context. We had some unilateral concessions from the university, but not the COLA demand that we were after. So in the aftermath, we were left to confront the question of how, in fact, to win transformational demands in the university. How to win the kinds of things that would change the lives of students, the lives of workers, and assert worker control over the university, both of which, of course, are anathema to the admin class. The grades had proved a potent weapon, but not enough on their own. So as much as we learned from comrades across the labor movement, we realized that we could not, in the university, simply recycle formulas, rules, let's say, about how to strike from other sectors. Unlike a port, as we've heard, a short-term shutdown does not inflict enormous damage on the university. Even unlike K through 12 schools, the empty classrooms do not have effects that rip through the community. I think our students just relax. So strike strategy in this relatively new and upsurging sector of the labor movement is an open question. So our position on this at this point is that striking to win real demands in higher ed requires the indefinite or long-haul withdrawal of labor time to maximize its impact. So the specific conditions of our workplace require us not only to stage a big mobilization, but to wage an extended struggle, something more like a war, in fact, against this admin class. This sketches the current state of our thinking, but it must be said we're still learning its fuller implications, particularly in connection with the stunning strike at Michigan right now. So I should note two main alternatives to this that we encounter in our context in the UC. One believes that whatever is not won by a supermajority strike vote and by very, very large demonstrations early in the strike simply cannot be won until some future mobilization. The other one is that we will need the ear and favor of state politicians if we want to win something big. So the first one diminishes the power of workers in advance and places worker demands beyond this receding horizon forever. The other one locates power elsewhere and meanwhile pins its hope on the very class of people who have overseen the dismal trajectory of higher education in recent decades. So before the Wildcat, we were in no position to think in these terms of a long-haul strike. In fact, that phrase crystallized out of the recent strike. And at the same time, your piece appeared, actually. And we were not able to develop it on the run during the Wildcat. But ahead of the more recent strike, we did consciously try to prepare for it. And I'm going to ask Sarah to tell you about it.
Yeah, so our experience of the Wildcat taught us that in the university, points of leverage are various. Pressure takes time to accumulate. As James and Jack has said, this is because deadlines can be shifted around, syllabi can be adjusted, requirements can be altered. So going into the contract campaign in 2022, we reasoned that in order to best position ourselves to win something like a COLA, which became the central and universal demand of the 2022 contract campaign, we needed to prepare for a long fight. The strike in 2022 differed from the Wildcat in important ways. So first, it was a sanctioned action. This meant that union staff, officers, and representatives from the international played a role in shaping it. It also meant that the work stoppage would be coordinated across the state at all 10 campuses. So the bargaining units that were involved in the strike represented something like 48,000 workers across the state. In the months leading up to the action, we participated in statewide discussions about strategy and tactics. A key question that emerged was how to best assess the strength of a potential strike action. Knowing whether or not our strike was strong, we thought would help workers feel confident in taking a risk. Many in statewide UAW staff and officer positions promoted what we'll call an additive theory of power. I think this is actually pretty common in the labor movement. The logic underpinning this theory is that each individual worker represents an equivalent amount of power. Therefore, in order to increase the power of a strike action, we needed to increase the number of workers on strike or threatening to strike. The practical activity that flows from this is essentially a voter turnout operation, where atomized individuals are mobilized by professional organizers to participate in an authorization vote or fill up space on a picket line. One problem with this formulation, however, is that it neglects the nature of our work and the ways in which leverage is unevenly distributed across our work site. On the instructional side, for example, the disruption of core or prerequisite classes creates greater administrative pressure than electives. This is due to the fact, as others have touched on, that internal processes in the university require completion of core or prerequisite courses in order to determine graduation or advancement in major. When students lack a grade for these courses, which we termed choke point classes, it creates a crisis that the administration must contend with. And it's worth saying that there is no straightforward way for management to respond. The management's response at the University of Michigan to their decision to enter falsified grades, I think, is something we should all be watching closely. Additionally, enrollments in core classes tend to be considerably higher than others, which means that striking them is necessarily more impactful. So in the summer, our organizing committee set out to map every course offering in every department, paying special attention to classes that, when struck, would inflict the most pain on our employer. We then worked with department stewards to identify who was TAing for each course. Next, we grouped together workers who were TAing for the same courses and encouraged them to do the following. So first, we encouraged them to set up a group chat that could provide a venue to collectively discuss or respond to issues that may arrive, like faculty interference or intimidation. Second, to deliver a teach-in to undergraduates, announcing their intention to strike and inoculating them against administration's attempt to divide us. On the research side, the uneven distribution of leverage was more difficult to chart, and we learned so much about this during the 2022 strike. Instead of courses, we mapped labs, focusing on those that seemed to generate the greatest amount of money or prestige for the university. Where we could, we noted where labs had contracts with industry, as these labs tended to be on shorter funding cycles and required deliverables on a quarterly rather than multi-year basis. Through mapping and department organizing, we learned a lot about research labor. We discovered that power is not uniformly distributed within labs, as jobs are not standardized and different workers are responsible for different parts of the labor process at different times. This means that during a strike, certain workers will possess more leverage than others, exposing them to greater intimidation and pressure from above. We learned, for example, of a laboratory in ocean sciences where a single worker held the knowledge needed to maintain a machine that was integral to the entire laboratory's functioning. We also discovered that labs on the verge of grant deadlines were in a greater position to exert pressure, as failure to submit data would likely jeopardize funding through which the UC collects a considerable overhead. But unlike instructional labor, and this is important, lab work is not synchronized. Labs do not share the same deadlines and research timelines usually stretch over months to years rather than days to weeks. Leverage is dispersed and its impacts are not immediately visible. And as a result, researchers' sense of collective power proved more difficult, though not impossible to establish. So what is the relationship between power mapping and waging a long-haul strike? Unlike an additive theory of power, the theory of power that underpinned mapping was about rigorously identifying where we were best positioned to hurt our employer. This allowed us to do three things. First, it allowed us to have a real assessment of the strength of our strike going into it. Second, and this became critical in maintaining our confidence for the long haul, it provided a basis for ongoing tracking of withheld labor, something that picket line sign-ins could not do. Every week, stewards and department organizing committees use power maps as a roster to check in with workers about whether or not they were still on strike. Our organizing committee collected data from stewards at weekly meetings, and we shared this widely. This knowledge on our campus produced a steadiness and resolve among workers that by all accounts was absent on other campuses. Third, power mapping emphasized small group organizing at the levels of departments and labs, which permitted the kind of collective deliberation and decision-making that are impossible in one-on-one conversations with organizers or at mass rallies. Organizing and strike strategy requires a certain level of concrete assessment and organic response, one that a canvassing approach to labor organizing and action cannot facilitate. And this is because it understands the task of organizers to be akin to door knocking or phone banking for a ballot measure or candidate. There's a smart ask. Either the worker does it or they do not. Either they are sufficiently mobilized or they are not. Under this model, there's no deliberative collective space that might put into motion new relationships, strategies, or tactics. Conclusion. Our strike ended with a contract ratification vote that displayed wildly divergent patterns across the state. Since it's impossible to imagine that the same contract was good enough for 70% of workers at UC San Diego, but only 20% at UC Santa Cruz, we must understand the ratification vote less as a verdict on the contract and more as a verdict on the strength and coherence of the strike and its prospects for winning more. You don't vote no unless you think you can win more. We thought we could win more. 4 in 5 workers at UCSC felt that we were in a position to win more, even as the contract was ratified across the state. We credit this in no small part to the mapping work we did and the patterns of organizing and deliberation that it promoted. In the curious workplace of the university, we see this as an indispensable approach to taking the kind of long-haul strike action necessary to win real demands.
Thank you, everyone. And I'm hoping that when we get into the working session tomorrow, we can actually get to the work of like looking at some of these mapping tools that you guys developed because they're really fantastic. Okay, so before opening up to questions from the audience, and I'm sure there are many, I just want to start by picking up on a thread that I think is kind of running through all of these and ask you all about it, which is that I think in various ways, you know, you're all conceiving of this longer temporality of strike strategy in opposition to what has, I think, developed as like a common orthodoxy certainly in like higher education labor movement, but I think in the labor movement more broadly. And that's an orthodoxy that imagines that I guess in various ways that imagines Lucy named it as like you're most powerful on the eve of the strike. It imagines that the power of the strike comes from the threat that you are going to strike. And in this way, it's about like showing the boss something. It's about producing a spectacle of our numbers. And so is very focused on those numbers and on those metrics. And I think we can just like, for shorthand, kind of name this as like the Jane McAlevey kind of tendency or something like this. The idea that you've got to produce that supermajority in order to scare the boss into doing something. So the strike threat, the strike authorization vote becomes kind of like the thing that you are actually organizing for, not the strike itself. And as you all have kind of framed it here, the long haul or the indefinite grading boycott or the kind of granular strategic analysis of research grant deadlines that Sarah was talking about seem to work on a different logic, right? The idea that you all lay out is that the strike isn't a spectacle of power, but it's the actual exercise of power. And the strike is a weapon that pits our strength against our boss's specific weaknesses. And so it needs to be grounded on a more careful strategic analysis of what those strengths and weaknesses are, rather than the simple like numbers game or the additive theory of power. So strategy might call for majorities or supermajorities, but you all seem to suggest that there are other ways to make the boss hurt too. So the question that I want to just kind of throw out here for the panel is, how do you all think about this in, about the relation of minority versus majority or supermajority action? What is the role of minority action in building to this? I think crucially, like keeping in frame that, what we all want to do here is rebuild a fighting labor movement that is willing to, break anti-worker labor laws to win, that is, we're interested in reviving the strike in a particular way. So that's, I think, one question I just want to pose to you is like, what is the role of minority action in this? And related to that, how do you see these debates playing out in your organizing context, in your unions? That's, I think, a good place to start. And you all can fight over who takes that first. So
I could offer to start. So I think the emphasis on a minority or majority like comes from somewhere. That's not just like, I don't think anyone truly believes that the numbers are magic or something, that they exert some power in and of themselves. That the idea that you want a certain proportion of workers taking a certain action in order to be effective comes from an orthodoxy that comes out of a particular work site, a particular place, and a particular way of doing something where doing minority action might not be wise, right? To say nothing of the investments that maybe staffers and lawyers and unions may have in wanting to avoid messy, protracted fights. So this is just to say that like it doesn't necessarily import into higher ed at all. And if we need a supermajority at 66 or 60, if we need 51% rather than 49, the case needs to be made strategically and concretely about why that is the case. Why can it not be a bit less or even a lot less? What are we trying to actually achieve? What will be the effects of this action? And I think this kind of thinking is just evacuated when you just set abstract structure tests, the origin of which you don't even consider informing your own strategy. And the point about the strike threat, like the credibility of your strike threat can only exist in terms of the reality of the strike that you're about to wage. It can't be disconnected from it. So it's not a question for us, I think, whether something is minority, supermajority, minority. It's like, what effect will it have and how credible is that threat? And then if we need to actually carry it out, will that get us what we're trying to get? I think that's all I'll say, except to just add quickly that this question never came up in the context of our Wildcat. It wasn't, do we have 60%? Do we have 50%? Do we, it was like, do we have enough, to cause the damage? And the answer by workers over and over in these daily meetings was yes.
This is a very interesting question. Part of this, what's interesting is that in the UK context, we have a structure test imposed on unions by law, by the Tory anti-trade union legislation, so that in order to go on strike, you have to get a turnout of 50%. And the turnout is, the exercise of getting out, it requires a huge amount of work. And so there's there is a Jane McAlevey structure test required by kind of hostile Tory legislation. And it does have this weird effect of like, you call people up and you're like, don't worry, like just vote for it. And then once we have the ballot, we'll definitely win because like they'll be really scared of us getting over the threshold. And you're even talking to people saying like, don't worry, you vote for it, you won't even have to take the action. So you kind of anti-inoculation basically through the turnout model. And that's the problem. And that tension exists kind of as a kind of peculiarity of UK labour law. There is an adage that's been bombarded at us from our union leadership, which favours the Jane McAlevey model of organising, which is that the longer the picket line, the shorter the dispute. And I really think that actually what we should be saying is the longer the dispute, the more comprehensive the victory, to be honest. And that's not because we like striking for striking's sake. It's because in order to exert the kind of pressure you need to win, you've got to be prepared to go for a long time. And they need to see that. And yeah, this spectacle point, this exactly plays out. And I went to a briefing session before the marking boycott we eventually voted to take. And our union officials in this meeting were briefing us hard that we should not do this and it was definitely not going to work. But they then also said that if you do it, we'll 100% back you. And they literally had a slide that said, think about it, right? That if we take this action, then it's going to be ineffective and we're not going to win anything. But the threat of ineffective action is definitely going to be what's going to win or something, right? That was literally said, like, action won't work, but the threat of action, which implicitly they're saying is going to be ineffective, is going to work. So it's a very, very bizarre thing. And I think you're right that there's no exact science to figuring out what density is the right density. You can cause an incredible headache by having a concentration in one very, very important place. And if you can have a high density spread across a huge area, and it won't necessarily be effective if those people are not organized and ready to do incredibly radical things. And you can be much more effective if you've got that kind of preparedness, but in smaller areas. Doesn't mean to say that there's we should prefer minoritarian action. Obviously, I prefer bigger actions, but we're definitely hampering ourselves if we believe that we need to. Because I mean, it's just very hard to win supermajorities in higher education, and I know that we should be organising to kind of get them. But if we make that our standard, we're basically imposing a Tory anti-trade union law requirement upon ourselves, and there's a reason the Tories introduced that.
I can say a bit about this as well.
Yes, and then we'll go to audience questions.
Okay. So maybe this is controversial here, but we started with a Jane McAlevey supermajority strategy. That's how we went in this leadership, being we want everybody to do this. We quickly ran into problems with that for the absolute absurdity of the way that our bargaining unit is shaped. So you're only an official bargaining unit member if you're a teaching assistant for that semester, meaning that you're in and out of the bargaining unit every semester. If you're on fellowship, you're not in, and if you're a research assistant, you're not in. And then on top of that, because we're in a right to work state, not anymore, but formerly, only some of the unit is actually in the union. So it becomes incredibly complicated as an organizer to count who it is that's a majority. So for a strike authorization, for example, we had a supermajority turnout of our union members. So then we had to ask ourselves the question, are we making decisions based on that chunk of people who aren't even, why would we not take action with the people who aren't even with us anyways? So we scaled back a little bit on the supermajority talk when we couldn't make sense of we couldn't make a majority meaningful to us. What was meaningful to us was consensus among the unit. So we had lots of people coming to meetings. It's over 1,000 people at some of these membership meetings, which is really overwhelming. And it was about having, when you walked out of that meeting, you wanted to be confident that we were all together. So the majority, the supermajority, is walking in the same direction. And there was a way that we measured that, which was we would pose a question of, do you think we should continue striking? And then you could write something in a form, and then we would show the yeses and nos. And so the yes column would be all the way full, and the no column would be a couple of people and some jokes. So we knew with those many hundreds of responses that those of us who were in this were moving together, and in that sense, a majority was really significant, but not in any concrete sense of the numbers of workers.
Thanks. Okay, so we've got time for a couple of questions here. We're going to end at about 20 minutes till. People can take a little break, and then we've got our next panel. So who's got something? Yeah, Robert in the back.
Oh, great presentation.
Oh.
I'm Robert Ovets. I'm a member of UCAFT and California Faculty Association at Berkeley and San Jose. I'm your typical contingent lecturer. So great presentation. It was really great to hear about the internal mapping that my colleagues in UAW did for your incredible strike last fall. One of the other issues that really kind of comes across each of these presentations is a struggle with how do you intensify the disruptive power? How do you build leverage? And I didn't really hear a solution to this. And I think it's a problem that we all face, and each of you have certainly addressed it and thought about it and attempted to resolve it, but I still didn't really hear, what do you think could work? Would it be improving the coordination of solidarity action by fellow university workers? One of the things that I think locks us into this orthodox way of organizing is that we have multiple units and each unit takes action separately. And I know that UAW did a great job in bringing in the researchers, but still, at the UCs, we have almost 20 different units at many of our campuses. And so I want to open it up for that question is what did you foresee as a way to intensify the disruptive impact of your collective action? Do I pass this on to somebody else?
Do you take one more?
Oh, yeah. We can take another question and then answer them as a stack. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. My name is Barry Idlin. I'm are we called retirees of UAW 2865 from Berkeley. I'm currently a sociology professor at McGill University. And I guess it's sort of maybe a different way of asking Robert's question, because where he's talking about like how do you build that disruptive power? Because the idea that a short strike is a winning strike doesn't just come out of nowhere, and it's not necessarily based in an additive power theory. There's also sort of a structural power thing that varies by industry, obviously. Warrior Met coal workers were out for a year, and they lost, and they went back to work with an unconditional return to work. Detroit newspaper workers went on a 5-year strike in the 90s. These are things that are sort of seared in the memory of a lot of not just labor leaders, not just bureaucrats, but like actual rank and file workers that you can stay out for a long time and lose. And I get the sort of specificity of the academic working conditions that make sort of being able to, that make the sort of withholding of grades in particular and be able to sort of like the accumulated disruptive power make it specifically important for academic work. I understand that point. But I guess for me the question is how do you distinguish between, or how do you prevent, how do you basically make a strike that actually builds power over time versus a strike that fizzles out and ends up sort of returning to work, basically. That's sort of the thing that concerns me. What are the strategies that you pursue for that?
So why don't we take those?
I think those questions speak well to each other. My sense is that when people say we can't do like the indefinite, let's go all out and not come back till we get what we want, they imagine an alternative which actually doesn't exist easily for us, right? If you look at the UCU strikes we've had in the UK, we've been out basically every year since 2018, taking like many, many days of action and losing many, many days of pay because of it. And my view, having gone through those 5 years, is that like we have lost an incredible amount of pay for going on those strikes. and the rate of attrition and burnout on activists and on members who were initially excited to be involved but were then dispirited when they found that actually just going out and protesting doesn't necessarily win you anything, even if you've got really articulate arguments and very, very nifty placards. And I think we need to think about the fact that when you say we are going all out and we're not coming back until we get what we want, it sounds like you are setting yourself up for a very long fight. And obviously I did just say that, right? The longer the dispute, the kind of more effective. But what I guess what I really mean there is that the aim is that you need to be prepared and in the position needed to go the long haul. And you need to front load and concentrate all of that pressure, right? We did 5 years of out and in and out, in and out, in and out. And if we had just taken all of that and put it at the most important point and kept going and not gone back, then it actually might have ended up being a less expensive process for the people involved, a less exhausting process. You need to plan that better. You need to get people in the mentality to do it. You need to give them the confidence to believe that it's going to work. And obviously, it's not without risks. I mean, that's like you need to inoculate people against those risks. But I guess from my experience in the UK, like the alternative to doing this has actually been a kind of stop-start 5-year-long thing that is in danger of fizzling out. So that's how I sort of square that. And I mean, there's a really important psychological difference between the indefinite strike and time-limited strike action, which is that I'm going now, and I'm not coming back. And getting a worker into a place where they can say that and feel like that's a good idea, compared to I'm doing my 2 days and then maybe 3 and then maybe 4 after that. If you don't come to it, like the psychological difference and the potential, the way that looks to the employer is just very, very different. And you end up doing the form in which you're delivering the same amount of days just can be massively more impactful. There's a whole load of questions about when exactly in the calendar. That will depend on your university, your context, exactly the administrative processes you're trying to undermine, etc. So it's hard to give a clear answer about when to stage this. I think it has to be a specific thing, but it's that willingness to go all out from the beginning, which I think we need to be trying to get towards, rather than kind of letting ourselves be kind of killed through 1,000 cuts of time-limited bursts of action.
I will just say one thing. I think, one of the things that our experience at Santa Cruz demonstrated was the importance of this kind of small group organizing as a way to sustain yourself through a long strike. So I think on other campuses, 5 weeks, 6 weeks felt like an eternity, because people were just kind of waiting for the report back from the bargaining team. Whereas on our campus, because there was more of a culture of, more of a collectivity that had been built, and people were, day to day checking in with one another, talking about strategy, debating, deliberating, there was a sense that we were held, like that we were together. And when duration starts to feel really scary, like this is going on too long, it's when you're feeling isolated and alone. So I don't know that there's like a magic formula about what to do, but I think if there is, at the basis of it is constructing these kinds of smaller, tight-knit collectives.
Yeah, and this is the question, I guess, that your questions combined. I would say like one difference to, for example, the newspapers, et cetera, and these other examples, like the inverse of why our work like doesn't impact immediately in the way that it might in another sector, is that we're really hard to replace. Santa Cruz does not have a pool of like theoretical physicists it can draw upon to teach, huge amounts of classes or to like, operate these machines. Like it's like a big employer and a big money venture. And these strikes actually do have a real effect, if not, in the concentrated, very short term, as James said so well. But we can't just be replaced. And we're even hard to punish. It's hard to find who exactly is doing it. They were unable to dock our pay, to know who's paid to dock for striking. And I look at the comrades from Temple here who got like hit really hard and were able to push through it and push the university back. We do have a certain kind of security that's the other side of this. Our Wildcat strike ended in it's very hard to assess the end because of the pandemic and national rebellions and things that were going on. But the recent strike, the limits I think we hit were a lack of inter-campus coordination that, while this campus felt really strong, I thought we were ready to go, into the winter and onwards if necessary. Mm-hmm. That was a limit. I think the question about being a more wall-to-wall sort of model, having other layers of the workforce striking at the same time, that would be immensely, that would help immensely to bring a strike to a successful conclusion in a shorter period. I think there's a timing thing, when to start a long-haul strike. I think increasingly we're learning, and courtesy of the Michigan strike as well, that maybe later in the fall is the time, because you have the grading that's struck, and then you have the new term coming around really soon, rather than after a whole summer. So those pressures sort of ratchet up, more quickly. So the last thing I'll also say is what winning is also a question that it can't just be measured by the final contract, and that's why I wouldn't say that our last contract was a win or not. What I think was the real gain from the strategy that we produced here, and to some extent managed to see some replication elsewhere, especially with some of the comrades here from Berkeley, was a deeper sort of strategic militancy among wider and wider layers of workers, people who could self-organize and act, whether or not they had the sort of support of the union infrastructure as it exists. I think that these are real wins, and these are the kinds of things that are less likely also to come out of a one-day action or something like that.
I want to add on to that last point. So I think the one-day strike, doing a strike authorization, that can get you a contract in a different kind of labor movement world where you've struck some kind of bargain with the employer in the long term. You have a bargaining relationship. Maybe a strike authorization gets you your 3% raise or whatever. I think one thing that we've been working on at Michigan is shifting the focus from that terrain of striking a bargain with an employer that is against our interests and encouraging a world that we don't want to be in. So we're shifting the terrain to struggling over what the university means itself, the class interests that have dominated it, and the ways that we all suffer there. That's something that's worth risking losing. And that's something that we've had to talk about in Michigan. Mm-hmm. For a 3% raise, no, I'm not going to lose a paycheck for that, or get fired, or give up my PhD. For switching the balance of power over a university that is representative of a deep class antagonism that we are losing is worth going all in for. And there is no guarantee of winning when you're on that terrain.
Yep.
On that note.